From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, my name is Jason Steinhauer, and I'm a program specialist at the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. Before we begin today's program, please take a moment to check your cell phones and other electronic devices, and please set them to silent. Thank you. I'll also make you aware that this afternoon's program is being filmed for placement on the Kluge Center website, as well as our YouTube and iTunes channels. I encourage you to visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge, K-L-U-G-E, to view other lectures delivered by current and past Kluge Fellows. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress in cooperation with the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. The NMAI cares for one of the world's most expansive collections of Native artifacts, including objects, photographs, archives, and media covering the entire Western Hemisphere, from the Arctic Circle to Tierra del Fuego. And since the passage of its enabling legislation in 1989, it has been dedicated to acting as a resource for the hemisphere's Native communities and to serve the greater public as an honest and thoughtful conduit to Native culture, present and past, in all their richness, depth, and diversity. We welcome staff and representatives from NMAI to today's program. The John W. Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars, postdoctoral fellows, and PhD candidates to conduct research in the Library of Congress collections. We also offer free public lectures, book talks, conferences, symposia, and other programs. And we administer the Kluge Prize, which recognizes lifetime achievement in the study of humanity, and which we will award in September of this year, 2015. Additionally, in June of this year, we will celebrate the 15th anniversary of the Kluge Center, which was founded in 2000, with a two-day celebration of scholarship on Capitol Hill in an event that we are titling Scholar Fest. For more information about these and other events, I encourage you to sign our email list in the back on your way out, or to visit our website to learn more. Today's lecture is titled The Indians' Capital City, Native Histories of Washington, D.C. Our speaker is Joseph Genetin-Pilawa, now concluding his tenure as a Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress. Joe's research examines the Native presence in Washington, D.C., in all its manifestations, representations, and contradictions. As Washington policies removed Indians from their lands in the South and West in the 19th century, Native residents and visitors were a continual presence in the nation's capital. Joe's research has revealed the depth and penetration of that presence, and he has mined rare and undigitized items in the library's collections to reveal surprising discoveries of how Native Americans were viewed, represented, even fetishized. Joe has given voice and agency to Native residents and visitors, and he used an interesting phrase in his time here, which is the notion of reading sources against the grain to draw forth the Indian view of the nation's capital and how they understood representations of themselves within the district. His work is an illustration of how the Library of Congress collections can help us tell alternate histories and round out the historical narrative to be more inclusive, diverse, and complete. You can read more about Joe's research on our blog, which is titled Insights. You can also read more about Joe's research on time.com. Now to introduce Joe. Joseph Genetin-Pilawa is an assistant professor at George Mason University. He is the author of Crooked Paths to Allotment, The Fight Over Federal Indian Policy After the Civil War, and the co-editor of Beyond Two Worlds, Critical Conversations on Language and Power in Native North America. Joe's current research examines the visual, symbolic, and lived indigenous landscapes of Washington, D.C., focusing especially upon ways that Native visitors and residents claimed and reclaimed spaces in the city. He's been conducting research as a Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress for the past 7 months, and he has been a wonderful addition to the center, a good colleague, and a good sport. I should tell you that on Joe's first day at the Kluge Center, before he had looked at a book, even before he had finished his orientation, we threw him in front of the camera for a C-SPAN interview. And it was a part of a 5-part series that we did focusing on scholars in residence doing research on topics related to American history. And Joe provided an exceptional interview, laying out all the resources at the library that he planned to use and how they intersected with his project, and he had yet to even get his reader registration card. It was a testament to his preparation, his knowledge, and his disposition that he pulled it off so smoothly, and that interview is also on our website, our blog, and you can find it in our Twitter feed as well if you want to watch it. So, please join me in welcoming Joseph Genetin-Pilawa.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank everyone at the Kluge Center. This has been a really amazing 7 months. The staff at the Kluge Center has been exceptional. Mary Lou, Travis, Jason, Nancy, and Jane make such a wonderful place for us to work. My fellows have been amazing as well. At times intimidating. I remember, I think my first week, the first time we all had lunch together and everybody went around to talk about their projects, I went back to my carrel and called a friend of mine and said, everyone here's smarter than me. And knowing me as well as he does, he's actually sitting here today, he said, are you hiding under your desk? And so I climbed out from under my desk and started ordering books and did some work. I want to acknowledge, too, where we are today. Of course, we're standing in the Library of Congress on Capitol Hill, but we're also standing on Piscataway homelands, and to be more specific, Anacostan and Nacotchtank homelands, who are tributaries, ultimately, of the Piscataway. So as I talk about the histories that make up the history of the nation's capital, I want us to think about the palimpsest, the layers of the urban archive here, and where that sort of bedrock is. On Saturday, September 29th, 1837, a group of Lakota, Iowa, Sac, and Fox men and women from the Missouri River sat in the National Theater in Washington, D.C., watching a romantic opera called The Mountain Sylph. They found themselves, as many of the other audience members likely did, mesmerized, watching the prima donna, a soprano named Annette Nelson, portray Aeolia, the sylph, the opera's lead character. So impressed by her agility and beauty, quote, appearing and vanishing with a rapidity that reminded them of the fleetness of the deer in its native hunting grounds, wrote one newspaper, the men saluted her right in the middle of the performance. In a show of respect, Pelena Papi, a Yankton man, removed his eagle-feathered cap and threw it at her feet. Pocana, a Sac chief, offered his cap as well, while Tokaka, another Yankton, gave her his white wolfskin robe. Although this was completely unplanned, the actress, in a display of impromptu grace and poise, thanked the men, saying she would, quote, ever regard them as friends and brethren. Then she removed the ostrich plumes from her wings and gave them back as a return gift to the men. To a modern audience, this appears to be an unexpected scene, and not just as a breach of proper theater etiquette. The actual presence of Native men and women in the 1830s in a theater in Washington enjoying an opera seems unbelievable. How unexpected was this, though? Despite what we might think today, across the 19th and early 20th centuries, hundreds and thousands of Native people traveled to and lived in the federal city. In reality, scenes like this one at the theater happened all the time. Yet it seems that a settler colonial cloak has come to obscure our ability to see and understand indigenous presences in the urban spaces of the capital. We've been trained to ignore, to overlook, and to hide them. While every Indian nation has its own unique and rich history, one thing that unites all of these experiences is a relationship with the federal government and Washington, D.C. And these experiences often overlapped. For example, a British diplomat, Sir Augustus John Foster, lived in the city in its earliest days before the War of 1812 and wrote a travel narrative filled with anecdotes about the multi-tribal experiences here. He described escorting a group of Mandan leaders to the theater, where they were seated next to 5 Osage men, a Delaware diplomat, and several Native women and children from various other nations. Foster also wrote about meeting a group of Osage men and women who were lodging in a boarding house with several Sac, Dakota, Mississauga, and Missouri leaders who were across the street from another boarding house where a large Cherokee delegation stayed. By the mid-19th century, even cultural representations of life in the capital featured Native people as prominent figures. In 1857, the play Fashions and Follies of Washington Life, which was meant to, quote, exhibit a panoramic view of the characters and events of the city, featured among its clerks and politicians and debutantes a, quote, live Indian chief named Tanawaha. These events appear unexpected to us today because of a perceived incongruity of Native people in urban spaces. And this unexpectedness is especially rooted in Washington, D.C., due to the creation of a commemorative landscape centered in the art and architecture of federal buildings, but dispersed around the city as well, that iterated spatially notions of pacification, of a conquest completed, and of vanishing Indians. And these are the 4 large historic paintings that are in the rotunda of the Capitol building. My larger project argues that unlike the native subjects of Capitol art and architecture, though, Indigenous visitors and inhabitants engaged with non-native individuals and symbols of settler society in Washington, D.C. They carved out their own spaces within it. They claimed and reclaimed an ownership of the place. In doing so, Indigenous people shaped how the Capitol came to understand itself as an imperial center. Washington was, after all, and especially in the 19th century, a local place, first and foremost. It had to learn. It had to become the nation's city and an imperial capital, and then later a global metropolis. I'd also like to take a moment here and acknowledge some of the scholars whose work has been particularly influential to me in this project. In terms of theory and method, Philip Deloria's book, Indians in Unexpected Places, and Cole Thrush's Native Seattle have been profoundly important in helping me conceptualize urban indigeneity and the ways that cultural expectations cloud our historical vision. More directly, I couldn't imagine doing this work without the foundation laid by Herman Viola's Diplomats in Buckskins, the go-to volume on Native diplomatic travel to Washington, and also the personal guidance and support that Herman's shown to me, as well as art historian Vivian Green Fried's Art and Empire, which examines the artwork in and around the Capitol building. I don't seek to refute or revise any of their arguments. I find them overwhelmingly persuasive. Instead, I'd like to tie them together and build from there. With the time I have today, I'd like to offer 3 collections of stories about the Capitol. Each collection addresses non-native cultural expectation, or the ways in which white Americans have imagined Indians, as well as the hidden native histories of the city. In an effort to accurately portray the diversity of experiences in the Capitol, the stories I tell here are each grounded in particular spaces within the city and move fluidly back and forth across time. This is a deliberate strategy that also seeks, as many Indigenous studies scholars have challenged us, to destabilize chronology as a narrative foundation and instead anchor our stories in place. The first collection focuses on the development of expectations of Indian violence and pacification expressed through art and culture, but also speaks to actual Indigenous presences in the city. The second demonstrates how Native people engage directly with those expressions, resisting and reshaping them. The third set of stories describes the deep layers of expectation and how recognizing hidden Indigenous histories of Washington provides us with a much different sense of the city. Collection 1, Tanawaha's Rage. In a scene in Act 4 of Fashions and Follies, the play I mentioned a few moments ago, Tanawaha, the lead Native character, accosts Emma, the female protagonist. Tanawaha exclaims his love for her, saying, "Oh, pretty, pretty, Indian-like squaw." He quickly laments, however, "Squaw no love Indian, Indian ugly man, squaw love great white chief." Moments later, Noel, who's described in the playbill as a man who literally, quote, knows all about it, enters and insults Tanawaha, calling him an ill-bred savage. Tanawaha responds by choking him. Only at the last second is he spared at Emma's urging. While Tanawaha is represented as part of the fabric of the city, he's also unpredictable, violent, and dangerous. The theme of potential Indian violence had deep roots in the capital and can be seen in other earlier expressions of public discourse. In 1828, for example, Margaret Bayard Smith, a chronicler of social life in the early capital, declared herself to be the, quote, self-constituted delegate of the young ladies of Washington and begged the Secretary of War, Peter Porter, to, quote, use his authority and forbid the ferocious Winnebagos from assaulting the girls in the manner they did. Lewis Cass, who was governor of Michigan Territory at the time, overheard the discussion and defended the Indians, but to no avail. Although Smith had not witnessed or experienced this treatment firsthand, the threat of sexual violence loomed large in her expectations. In a letter to her husband, she exclaimed, "You have no idea what a general dread these Indians have inspired." Washington newspapers often commented upon Indigenous diplomats who visited the city, and many of their columns lent credence to the notion that these diplomats were ill-prepared for existence in an urban space, and that violence by native men was a constant possibility. In 1828, again, the National Daily Journal warned that the Ho-Chunk delegation in D.C. at the moment will, quote, no doubt be much annoyed by the countless number of idle boys who will follow them. The reporter imagined potential violence, stating that the boys should feel, quote, a sense of personal danger because these Indians would not abide their pranks like other D.C. visitors. Later in the same article, the columnist warned, playing upon expectations of Indian drunkenness, that no one should give the Indians, quote, ardent spirits because they are already sufficiently ungovernable and when excited cannot be controlled. Closely related to the fears of potential violence, newspaper commenters frequently imagined how overwhelming the experience of visiting the capital must have been for these Indian men and women as well. In an 1858 letter to the editor in the Daily National Intelligencer, detailed an account of a sightseeing tour of a delegation of Pawnee, Ponca, Dakota, and Potawatomi representatives. At the end of the article, the author speculated that there could, quote, be no doubt that the events of the day will be long impressed upon their memories. The writer read the moment as one in which Indian visitors were clearly ill-prepared when he noted that the Pawnee, who saw fit to honor their host with a dance, had to be informed that, quote, owing to the differences in taste, they must, in deference to the white ladies present, remain fully dressed. Moreover, he suggested, in a not quite so hidden concern about sexuality, that the exchange affected the native men so much because they were, quote, hampered at not being permitted on the occasion to dance themselves out of their clothes. Under the headline, Arrival of Distinguished Scalp Hunters, again suggesting potential violence, another writer recounted the first evening tour of the 1870 Lakota delegation that included, among others, Spotted Tail, Swift Bear, and Red Cloud. The reporter described with amusement how the, quote, bewildered sons of the forest wandered around Pennsylvania Avenue before retiring to their hotel rooms. Once there, the mysteries of urban life continued to confuse them, he suggested, because, quote, not knowing the comfort of mattresses and sheets, the Indians clung to their primitive notions of luxury by sleeping on the floor. So Spotted Tail and Red Cloud were on their fifth visit out of 12 each. And it's possible, too, that the fleas and bed bugs in the mattresses were why they were sleeping on the floor, but these are just my guesses. Another reporter concluded after several days of meetings and sightseeing tours that the Indians were, quote, rather astonished at the sights that have met their vision in the civilized regions that they have passed, and that Spotted Tail already had, quote, more than he could tell his people than 12 months' time would allow. The theme of Indian violence is clearly expressed in the artwork within and surrounding the U.S. Capitol building, and just for purposes of orientation, it's right on the other side of that window there across the street. But there it simultaneously occupies rhetorical space with expressions of pacification or a conquest nearing completion. These are the four reliefs in the Capitol Rotunda that are juxtaposed next to the historic paintings that I showed in the earlier slide. Carved between 1825 and 1827, each of these reliefs sits above the directional doors in the rotunda. They're entitled Preservation of Captain Smith by Pocahontas, Landing of the Pilgrims, William Penn's Treaty with the Indians, and the Conflict of Daniel Boone and the Indians. The final relief depicts a violent mortal struggle between Boone and an anonymous Indian warrior, both of whom are standing atop a second already defeated Indian man. Taken together, these reliefs portray moments of initial contact within a colonial world, and the overall message is one of inevitable subjugation or assimilation for Native people. Countless native visitors viewed the rotunda reliefs, but the tale that was most often told in 19th century tourist guidebooks involved the Ho-Chunk delegation of 1837. Now, these guidebooks were an incredibly useful source for me, and here the library has about 140 of these. This particular story originated in William Force's Picture of Washington and its Vicinity. The Indians, he wrote, whose faces, quote, were painted of various colors with their scalping knives and their tomahawks and their long iron-looking bows and arrows, examined the first 3 reliefs but stopped in front of the Boone image. There they, quote, looked intently, scrutinizing every scene, and then suddenly, as of one impulse, they raised a dreadful war cry and ran hurriedly from the hall. Force offered no further explanation and left his readers to wonder if perhaps the Ho-Chunk ran out to avenge the deaths of the depicted Indians, but his message was clear. These men were not suited for life in the city, and the potential for violence, again, was bubbling just below the surface. Violence and American nationhood progressed hand in hand, wrote Western Shoshone historian Ned Blackhawk, and both the commemorative landscape of the capital, as well as the perceptions of non-native journalists and guidebook authors, seemed to reflect that. Of course, a focus on the lived indigenous landscape of the capital suggests otherwise. Collection 2, Ely Parker's Challenge. In 1847, visiting Washington on behalf of the Tonawanda Seneca, Ely Parker stood in the Capitol Rotunda and challenged the legacy of those moments depicted in sandstone. Parker would go on later to become the first Native American commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, just following the Civil War. In his diary, which is a great source that is at the American Philosophical Society, he wrote about seeing the rotunda reliefs that I just finished describing in the last collection of stories. I want to read from the full entry from his diary for that day. Saturday, January 2nd, 1847. Went up to the Capitol and listened to some nonsensical speeches made by some nobody member of Congress. So that's like... the more things change, the more they stay the same moment, right? In entering the rotunda of the Capitol, the first object meeting my vision is the representation of the landings of the Pilgrims in 1620 upon the barren shores of New England. They're represented as in a starving condition, and being about to land, an Indian has come forward offering them provision of his bounty. Who now, of the descendants of those illustrious pilgrims, would give one morsel to the dying and starving Indian? Turning around, we were met by another representation in plaster of Paris of William Penn and the Indians entering a treaty. What virtue is there now in Indian treaties? Turning around a little more, we observe another representation, that of the young and beautiful Pocahontas, saving Captain Smith at the risk of her own life. Who now among the descendants of those whom she saved would risk his or her life for an Indian? No sooner would they see him hanged like a Mexican traitor than risk one hair on their heads to save him. And this was happening right in the middle of the Mexican War, so there's a little context for that part. How ungrateful is man to his fellow man? Turning still more around, we find another and final representation, intended no doubt as a climax to the whole scene, that of Colonel Boone, the hero of Kentucky, in a mortal combat with an Indian. Both are struggling for life, but Boone has already killed one Indian and trampled on his mangled body. Such is the fate of the poor red man. His contest with the whites is hopeless, and yet he is not permitted to live even in peace, nor are his last moments given to him by his insulting foe to make peace with God. Humbly we ask whether justice will always sleep, will not the oppressed go free? Far from screaming and running from the Capitol building as guidebook authors suggested of the earlier Ho-Chunk delegation, Parker engaged with the narrative of conquest. He critiqued the hypocrisies of the image. His very presence and the overt challenge marks a dramatic response to expectations about the capital where Indians are supposed to be bewildered, violent, or simply absent. White Washingtonians who might have read about the wild, unpredictable, and potentially violent Indians visiting their city had ample opportunity to view them as well. In this case, though, it seems they felt most comfortable seeing them on canvas and wood rather than in person. For a 20-year period in the early 1800s, Charles Bird King, a Washington artist whose studio was located nearby the War Department building, painted Indian delegates. Thomas McKinney, the longtime Commissioner of Indian Affairs, used government funds to purchase nearly 150 of these portraits and arrayed them along the walls of the Indian Office. And I should say here, too, the Library of Congress has a large collection of the prints and lithographs of these portraits. The portraits themselves were lost in a fire at the Smithsonian in the 19th century, but luckily they'd been printed and lithographed. And I think the library has about 100, a little over 100 of these in the prints and photographs collection. Leaders from John Ross to Keokuk, Black Hawk to Red Jacket graced the gallery. For more than 3 decades, distinguished visitors, international and domestic, made their way to the Indian office to visit them. In his 1830 guidebook, Jonathan Elliott encourages readers to stop at the Indian office. It, quote, possesses much interest, he stated, perhaps more than any other in the government. The paintings, he wrote, were, quote, not only fine specimens of art, but close resemblance to the originals. They are perfect. Refusing to submit to the expectation that they were simply passive subjects, Native men and women also sought out the portraits. For example, in 1828, a group of Ho-Chunk visited the gallery, became the subject of a lengthy correspondence between Commissioner Kenny and Secretary of War Peter Porter. The Indians, quote, delighted in seeing so many who were known to them, but complained, we see no Winnebagos here. So in the 19th century, they would have been referred to as Winnebago. A proper term would be Ho-Chunk. The government had for a time refused to pay for the portraits, but the visitors, McKinney wrote, were making almost daily visits, and they, quote, evinced so much anxiety to have similar respect paid to them that they offered to sell their bells and ornaments and caps and war clubs to defray the cost of the portraits, or barring that, ask at least that those items could be hung in the gallery as memorials. In the end, 5 of the men sat for King to commemorate the visit, and when they returned home, Caleb Atwater, who was the government agent at Prairie du Chien, said that, quote, nothing pleased the men so much as that their likenesses were in the War Department. Seeing the paintings and being a part of the group meant something. The visitors looked for portraits of members of their communities who had visited the city previously. It became a way to connect across time with people who had had similar experiences. But I'd like to posit 2 other explanations for why having one's portrait in the collection was so significant. First, as you can see on the screen, the men were depicted wearing symbols of power and prestige for their accomplishments in their social position and political position, things like feathers, ribbons, peace medals. But second, and more importantly, it became a way to mark the landscape as Indigenous and commemorate the experience of being in this place. Right? I liken it to scrawling "A Mishki was here," 1828, on the wall. It's a way of claiming the space. In the book that I'm working on, the story that I'm telling about Charles Bird King and the Indian Gallery will be juxtaposed against the 1972 73 BIA takeover. When the young men there actually spray painted graffiti all over the walls of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I think this is an example of Indigenous tagging. The final story in this collection moves us out of the 19th century. The 2 statue groups that stood on the cheek blocks of the Capitol building's east front for over 100 years were curiously removed in 1958. And if we lifted the blinds there, we could see where they'd sat for nearly 100 years, right across the street. Horatio Greenow's rescue and Luigi Persico's discovery of America were commissioned, carved, and placed in the 1830s through 1850s. And although there were some initial critiques, as there were for every piece of art in and around the Capitol, the statues served as fixtures at every presidential inauguration from the 1850s on. And there's a picture from Lincoln's first inauguration. You can see the 2 statue groups sort of bookending the staircase. James Buchanan said that Persico's group represented the, quote, great discoverer when he first bounded with ecstasy upon the shore, all of his toils and perils past, presenting a hemisphere to the astonished world with the name America inscribed on it. Of course, it's worth noting that Senator Charles Sumner, a consistent critic of Capitol art, demanded, what is Columbus going to do, play a game of 9 pins? It looks like he's about to bowl. Secretary of State John Forsyth said of the statues on the other side of the staircase, I know of no single fact in profane history that can balance the one so wisely chosen by Mr. Persico as the subject of Greenow's group, which shall commemorate the dangers and difficulty of peopling our continent, ignoring, of course, the fact that the continent had been peopled. In the initial critiques, those most vocally antagonistic to Greenow's effort focused on the dog. You can see in the bottom corner there. And I read dozens of these critiques in art journals from the 19th century. All of them talked about the dog. They talked about its placement, its demeanor, its attitude, its facial expression, and the accuracy of its imagined breed. I guess there's some question of whether or not a Newfoundland would have been in the late 18th century in Kentucky or wherever the scene is supposed to be taking place. Little was said of the more dramatic and violent components of the group. In the 1950s, though, a campaign led by a Native woman, she was Omaha, her name was Leda Myers Smart, resulted in the removal of the statues for good. They're currently held in a remote Smithsonian storage facility at Fort Meade, although before ending up there, they sat at the Capitol Power Plant just a couple of blocks over for a while. Smart wrote dozens of letters in the 1950s, including one that was published in Harper's, and ultimately garnered the support of several congressmen and senators, as well as the architect of the Capitol. In her Harper's piece, Smart wrote that the message of the statues was unflattering and unjust. In her rhetoric, Smart deployed the language of Cold War internationalism, and I think this contributed significantly to her success. For example, in a 1953 letter to the National Sculpture Society, from whom she was seeking support, she wrote, "The American Indian is no longer, if he ever was, the bloodthirsty savage Greenough made him out to be in this group of sculpture. We feel we ought to rescue the Indians from these deplorable straits, not forgetting to mention the other reasons why this should be done, or because those statues are bad propaganda for America and would make excellent fodder for our enemies." In another letter, she wrote that removing the pieces would be, quote, in better keeping for the right kind of propaganda of Americanism. In yet another, she argued that replacing the statues would demonstrate that the United States deserved to be, quote, in the enviable position of being a good example to the rest of the world. In a fourth, she stated that rescue and discovery were, quote, not only a disgrace to the Indians, but something that is not good for our country, something that could be made much of and in the wrong way if our enemies were wont to make something of them. By framing her critiques in terms of international politics of the Cold War, and by using patriotic rhetoric, Smart infused her campaign with a certain amount of urgency. It's worth noting, too, that she never missed an opportunity to infuse some humor, too. In a letter to the long-serving architect of the Capitol, David Lynn, she threatened, quote, to take a stick of dynamite, no, 2 sticks, and blow up the rescue group. And then she wrote in the margins, laugh, which to me was like 1950s LOL, right? Then, feigning fear that she might have just incriminated herself, she suggested that perhaps she just, quote, have to get some communists to do the job for her. Although there were several other factors that contributed to the removal of the statues, her campaign played a major role. In a letter to George Stewart, who was Lynn's replacement as the architect of the Capitol, on the subject of what should happen to these statues, a Republican congressman from Michigan, August Johansson, wrote, "Maybe this is a good time to make peace with the Indians." Smart's campaign is important because removing these statues represents a refusal to succumb to non-native expectations. It demonstrates how native visitors and inhabitants continued and continue today to carve out a place, commemorate, and engage with the city and its symbols. Collection 3, Kicking Bear's Presents. In 2010, a fellow historian and I were in Washington, D.C. One day I went to the archives and he went for a run. When I returned to our room later that evening, he asked if I knew anything about a bridge with 4 gigantic buffaloes on it. I'd only just begun the research for this project, and I knew nothing about this bridge or even that it existed. I went back to the archives the next day. He went for a walk around the city with his camera. When I returned the second evening, he showed me pictures of the buffaloes as well as 56 Indian head reliefs that adorn the bridge. Native people are everywhere in the city, he said. I had to learn more. And there you can see the busts. The busts there on the bridge. There are 56 of them, but they're actually the same one, just replicated over and over again, 28 on each side. Georgetown was formed in 1751, decades before the District of Columbia or the city of Washington. For most of the 19th century, Georgetown remained a separate legal entity from the capital, but in 1871 it was merged with Washington. Rapid growth and residential sprawl over the next few decades encouraged city leaders to provide a connecting artery between North Georgetown and DuPont Circle. There was one problem, as you can see from the map. Rock Creek and the surrounding heights separated the two. The initial plan called for filling in the gorge with rocks and junk and just paving over it, which was a really bad idea. But the McMillan Commission, which is a Senate committee whose report guides capital development to this day, rejected it, opting instead for a bridge. So they selected Q Street as the location for the new bridge, despite the fact that Q Street in Georgetown is 185 feet south of Q Street in DuPont Circle, so the bridge would need a curve. They also came to a dead end at the historic Dumbarton Mansion, which would have to be lifted up off its foundation and shifted about 100 feet. Still, it's better than filling in the gorge with a bunch of stuff. Glenn Brown, who was a proponent of the Macmillan Commission and the City Beautiful movement, designed the bridge, while famous animal sculptor Alexander Filmster Proctor made the buffaloes. The bridge features several City Beautiful design elements. For example, its neoclassical arches, corbel arches, piers, and pillars are reminiscent of Roman aqueducts. More obviously, its scale and style were typical of the City Beautiful aesthetic. After all, they could have just built a functional and utilitarian structure, and so they built this grand bridge. The use of the buffalo and Indian head iconography, the most distinctive elements of the bridge, also connect its design to the City Beautiful movement. The movement got its start in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair. And like the World's Fair itself, the bridge reflects a certain nostalgia for a vanishing frontier. In fact, in an interview, Glenn Brown noted, "We naturally determined to give the carvings and the other portions of the structure an American character." In this formulation, it makes sense then that the designers chose what seems to be a generic plains motif. These images are mobile and serve as free-floating stand-ins for a constellation of ideas that simultaneously express and excuse settler anxieties and guilt. The problem, of course, is that these images aren't free-floating and that these histories aren't metaphors. There's another way to look at this bridge and think about its iconography, though, but it requires us to unearth the layers of non-native expectations and to look into the deep indigenous history of the city. The busts that sit below each pillar were actually modeled from the life mask of Mata Wanadeka, or Kicking Bear, a Minikanju Lakota leader who played a significant role in bringing the ghost dance movement to the plains. In the 1890s, Kicking Bear traveled to Washington, D.C. to advocate on behalf of the Lakota at the Office of Indian Affairs. It was then that he visited the Smithsonian and had the life mask made. As an anti-colonial leader of the ghost dance movement, a critic of white settlement, and an outspoken leader, Kicking Bear actually reminds me a lot of the Ho-Chunk delegates I talked about in the first story and Letta Myers-Smart in the second. Simultaneously to Kicking Bear's visit, archaeologist William Henry Holmes, who worked for the Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology and then served as head curator of anthropology at the U.S. National Museum, conducted significant excavations around Washington, including digging up Connecticut Avenue at one point. One of the sites that his team investigated thoroughly was the Dumbarton Heights, an area just north of where the bridge is ultimately built. There, Holmes and his team found an important stone quarry site where Piscataway peoples, for generations upon generations, excavated materials and made stone tools. And there's an image from that excavation. So here it is, all wrapped up in one site, a bridge that was built in the 19-teens using cutting-edge architectural technology and trendy design elements that are meant to memorialize and celebrate a generic and supposedly bygone American past. But the bust the designer used actually commemorates a native leader who challenged U.S. colonialism spiritually and militarily on the plains, as well as politically in the city itself. They built it atop land that has been significant to indigenous inhabitants since time immemorial. Ancient, modern, vanishing, and ever-present. So I said there were 3 collections of stories, but there's actually a short epilogue. On April 26, 1978, the director of the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archive, Herman Viola, interviewed Henry Old Coyote, a member of the Crow Nation and advisor to the Senate on legislation involving indigenous communities. Viola, who I mentioned at the beginning of my paper, created a program at the Smithsonian earlier in the 1970s called the American Indian Cultural Resources Program, and it was designed to provide opportunities for Native people who were interested in pursuing careers as archivists, curators, and historians. In the course of this far-flung conversation, Old Coyote talked about the reasons a visit to Washington, D.C. was meaningful for many people, many Native people. It's the nation's capital, he said, but it's more like a shrine to the Indians. He continued, laying out a juxtaposition. It's undesirable to the Indian, but there's a sacredness of the city. Perhaps sensing the complexity in Old Coyote's response, Viola pressed further, asking what was important symbolically about Washington. Old Coyote answered, "Indigenous people love their country, and Washington is the seat of the government, and as such, they feel that a certain reverence should be extended to the place." As I read through the transcript of this interview in the early summer of 2012, I found Old Coyote's words laden with significance. He was speaking not only for Native visitors and inhabitants of the capital in the late 20th century, but referred to historical experiences of indigenous people as well. The complexity of his thoughts on the subject of placemaking, That the city was simultaneously sacred and undesirable points to a fundamental uneasiness at the heart of my project. The stories I've told here today are only a few that I've compiled in my research thus far. And while I've spent most of my time talking about Indigenous presence in the city, I also want to honor the Indigenous present. The kinds of work and experiences I've described occurring over the last 200 plus years by no means exist only in the past. Native scholars, artists, museum curators, attorneys, and others continue in earnest today. It's heartening that it does. It's appalling that it has to. Sacred and undesirable. Rather than offering firm conclusions, I'd prefer to leave with some tentative suggestions and thoughts. In these stories, place matters. And Washington, D.C. was not a place where most people came from, but where they ended up. Aside, of course, from the Piscataway. But that makes this project different from many studies of Native peoples in place. In the case of the commemorative landscape of the city, the portrayals of Native violence, as well as the iconographic message of a conquest completed, came from the minds of European artists and the U.S. policymakers who commissioned them. These portrayals were not only significant as a symbolic justification for actual federal policies, but came to represent an emerging cultural mythology along the physical landscape of the national imaginary. Here, white men claimed ownership of the city and the nation, and decorated it with images of conquest. Yet, as these stories suggest, they were never successful in commanding the city or the nation in a way that precluded the claims of others. Commemorative expressions also hit a much more complex and interesting lived landscape in which Native people engaged with non-Native individuals and the symbols of settler society in Washington City. In the telling of these stories, I echo a critique of the idea in popular culture and academic scholarship that Indians and cities cannot coexist, and that one must necessarily be eclipsed by the other. That certainly hasn't reflected the history of Washington, D.C. These stories are able to demonstrate how Native actions have all too often been interpreted through the lens of Euro-American expectation, and to help us think about how we came to certain kinds of tellings and not others. For me, one of the most important elements of this project is its ability to suggest the possibilities of hidden Indian histories. But perhaps they're not actually all that hidden if we take the time to look. After all, they're written in stone and paint. They're plastered all over the walls, and they're lived out on the streets. Thank you. So I think we have some time for questions and discussion if anyone is interested.
Are there any estimates of how many Indigenous people live, say, in the square of what? 1700 and in 1800?
There's a great, albeit small, exhibit at NMAI on the second floor in the alcove called "We Are Still Here" or "We Are Here," which talks about the continued existence of Piscataway communities. On the screen here is an image of a map that shows what it referred to, at least when the map was made in 1889, ancient village sites. And you can see all of the little sort of triangles, diamonds, are all within the district, and all village sites there. In terms of like a numerical estimate, I couldn't say for sure. But clearly, and actually the one that's really interesting to me, sort of in the middle of the city, you can see where the Capitol building is, and just to the south and east of that, there was a village, probably just off of Capitol Hill, actually. What's that?
How many triangles?
I haven't counted. In the back, yeah.
Moved to D.C. in the late 60s. I heard a presentation in which it was said that the site which of the Botanical Gardens at the foot of Capitol Hill had been where Chief Pohanka lived. At that time, we thought Pohanka is an Oldsmobile dealership. And it was said
I think it still is, right?
that's not Chevy and Ford. In any event, that it was said that land had a special peaceful quality, and that Native Americans and others would go to that land when they were contemplating making a decision. And the same was said of the land that was filled up with the Jefferson Memorial as being a place of very spiritual meaning to the Do you know if that's true about Chicohanka and where the Native Americans are?
I don't. It's interesting that that's really close to where NMAI sits today. Right sort of across the corner there. To me, a really interesting spot in the city is actually Congressional Cemetery. And I didn't talk about this today, but there are about 24 Native people who are buried in the cemetery. These were delegates and their family members who died while they were in the city. And that's where they were buried. If you walk around the cemetery today, those grave sites are commemorated and celebrated in ways unlike any of the other grave sites in the city. So if you walk around, you'll see piles of earth, stones, pennies, and other things that individuals from those communities bring and leave there. Interestingly, there's also a gigantic totem structure in Congressional Cemetery, which was brought by a Northwest Coast carver in the aftermath of September 11th, traveled 3,000 miles across the country, visiting 11 communities where ceremonies of healing and rebirth were done on the totems, and then they're brought to the Capitol building and then ultimately moved to Congressional Cemetery. Yeah, Srika.
Thanks for a great talk revealing so much about the not so Indian history of DC. Is there also in your archive a story of cultural hybridity, of miscegenation? You talked about the settler and the white the settler in Indian cities, but is there an even more anxious story?
Well, so again, this is something that I wasn't able to sort of fit into the talk today, but Jason actually kind of referenced it in my in his introduction that there's this whole interesting body of sources that exists in the library here. It's social life and customs manuals that were written by Victorian-era white women. Reading these things, which again, this is a source I never would have imagined being particularly useful, they're filled with these sort of anecdotes and also imaginings about Native men, and particularly Native men's bodies. So if you can imagine sort of very proper, elite, Victorian-era white women whose sexuality was very closely policed as sort of the keepers of the race and things like that, writing in very overtly sort of eroticized and sexualized ways about Native men and their bodies in this time. And I've thought a lot about that, actually. And to me, anyway, one way to make sense of that is that it wasn't controversial. It wasn't, there were Native men and white women who married one another in the city very publicly. And it didn't cause any kind of, there were no protests or no one was being burned in effigy or anything. In fact, it was kind of dealt with in the media and the newspapers kind of playfully and like with curiosity. At one of them, 5,000 white women showed up at the church to witness the ceremony of Ely Parker, in fact, marrying this young white woman. But to me anyway, it seems like this was a place where Native people were viewed as sort of transient, as not threatening, right? This was and another way of thinking of it is this would have been a safe place, quote unquote, for white women to write in these ways, whereas let's say the Dakota Territory at the same time, it would not have been equally okay, right? There would have been a more present threat, I suppose, would be a way to think about it. So I think that's another way of actually getting at these sort of expectations that I've been talking about. Kina.
Is there any, I'm aware of the delegates meeting with presidents and representatives of the community, advocating for things that they need. Is there any documentation of, I guess, more well-to-do Indigenous families that are just Catholics through D.C. in their travels, or people that did live there? Like, is there non-political Indigenous people that came through D.C. and their writings of everything?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things there. So there's a whole group of 19th century Native men who lived in Washington for varying lengths of time. These happen to be, they're oftentimes referred to in the documents from the period as resident delegates. We might think of them today as lobbyists. So, I mean, they were doing a political job, but these are people like John Ross. John Ross lived, during the removal crisis, lived in Washington, D.C. for months at a time. One time he wrote that he felt more at home in Washington than anywhere else. Peter Pitchlynn, a very prominent Choctaw leader, lived in Washington with his family. Ely Parker spent months at a time and then ultimately lived here for several years. So there's sort of those kind of people. If we fast forward to the 20th century, things get really interesting because groups like Osage, sort of oil-rich Osage delegates, but also sort of other people would come to the city to do business at the Bureau of Indian Affairs or with legislators, but they'd also like rent out entire floors of the Watergate Hotel and throw these amazing parties, which, the Bureau of Indian Affairs wasn't particularly happy about, but had to be pretty cool. The Yakama Nation in Washington, for part of the later 20th century, actually kept a private jet on retainer to fly people back and forth to Washington, D.C. I'm mostly a 19th century historian, although this project is forcing me into the 20th century in a lot of ways. But it's because of those stories, because those stories are so fascinating, and again, I think provide another layer to the city's history. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Did you find any students of Native ancestry who are at any of the colleges in the area?
So nearby, so I'm sure there are. So the Hampton Institute was in Virginia, was obviously really significant. And one of the people that I talked about, Leda Myers-Smart, actually studied at Hampton in the early 20th century, then went on to teach at Zuni boarding school before coming back to Washington and then moving to California, which says something about sort of early 20th century indigenous mobility too, something we don't think about very often. I mentioned at the very beginning a guy named Augustus John Foster. He actually became close friends with a young Native man named Wapani Ha, who was from the Great Lakes. I don't know, he was at Three Fires. I don't know if he was Potawatomi, Odawa, or Ojibwe, but he was here as a student. And in his travelogue, he writes about sort of going on various sort of sightseeing tours with Wapani Ha. But in terms of, again, sort of giving a sense of, numbers there, it's a little bit more difficult. But those are some of the stories that I've come across, sure. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, Anthony.
I'm staring at these triangles, and I was wondering two things. One, that mostly seems to be on the term Anacostia. I was wondering what was the economy of these villages prior to the drawing of the box, and secondly, when the box was drawn and DC became the capital, what was the fate of these villages and how were they eventually eliminated from the map?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and so clearly the settlements along the rivers, make sense because it was both for transport, but also for like harvesting the bounty of the rivers, right? Which sort of speaks to your question about economy. In terms of so there was one of the problems with this map, and I wanted to show it because it's one of the interesting things I found in the map collection. I don't know enough about what they meant by ancient village sites in 1889 in drawing these maps. I'm hopeful that I'll be able to get into some of William Henry Holmes's other work about his excavations, but I'm not sure how like if at all into the 19th century these particular sites continued to be vibrant villages or living spaces. In fact, it's probably kind of unlikely that most of them were still inhabited at that point. Yeah, thank you.
Let's stop there. Give a hand for
Thank you.
Thank you again to Joe for a fascinating talk. Thank you all for coming. A quick announcement. So next week the Kluge Center is hosting the annual J.I. Kislak lecture, and the the topic this year is forensic imaging of historic manuscripts. So if you're interested in new technologies and how they are allowing us to analyze historic sources, I encourage you to come to that. It's 6:30 p.m. on next Thursday, in the building across the street, the Madison building. Please do sign our list on the way out if you're interested, and thank you all again so much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.